Continuing this morning, I am so privileged and honored to actually have the next speaker travel all the way from Europe to talk to us about his incredible expertise. Dr. E.T.L. Dror is a neuroscientist, and he also studied at Harvard. He has worked with the United States Air Force pilots and many forensic scientists and experts trying to understand whether there is any cognitive underpinning in their opinions that they form, whether there is any bias, as the Deputy Attorney General hinted earlier in his presentation. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles specifically looking at cognitive factors that mediate human expert performance. And he has trained numerous forensic scientists all over the world. Please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Dror.
I'm very happy to be here today. I'm thankful for the opportunity to talk to you. And I'm going to talk about, and I really appreciate being here to talk to you about judgment, bias, investigation. And we hear the word bias and judgment in politics, in forensic, and in other sciences. So I'm here to talk about the science behind bias because science matters. What science? It's cognitive neuroscience, trying to understand the human brain, cognitive architecture, how people make decisions, judgment, perception. And what I'm going to try to do in the very limited time we have to explain what bias is, because most people don't understand. They think it's discriminatory racism of one sort or the other. So we need to know what bias actually is, where it comes from, and how we can countermeasure it. But we can't talk about how to minimize it if we don't understand where it comes from and what it is. So let's talk about judgment, and let's start with the judgment. So if you can look at the screen, and I'd like you to make a judgment how attractive this person is on a scale of 1 to 5. 1, not at all, and 5, quite attractive. Who thinks number 1? 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, everybody is almost 4 and 5. And I'm not going to ask you to rate this person. And it's definitely I will ask you who do you find more attractive, regardless if you're a man or a woman or heterosexual or homosexual. I think that we will find a great consistency that the person on the left is more attractive. Now, this is a subjective judgment. We do not know the objective way people decide if someone is attractive or not. And believe me, there has been a huge investment in trying to understand what is the objective. How do we reach a conclusion about attractiveness so consistently? It means the fact that things are subjective doesn't mean they're not reliable. You can have subjective judgment and very good work. And here I don't agree with PCAST, President Obama's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology, where they say, oh, we need statistics for everything. We need objective criteria. If not, it's not good. I am for it. If you can have it, that's great. But if you don't have objective criteria, it doesn't mean that your judgments are not valid judgment, reliable judgment, and good judgment. So the first thing I want to say to you that subjectivity is not a nasty word. It's not a bad word. Subjective judgments are fine. So if you do fingerprint or DNA mixture or forensic anthropology or handwriting or firearm and you don't have an objective quantification and you have judgment and interpretation, don't panic or panic because they criticize you, but I think as a cognitive neuroscientist that specializes in expert decision-making in many domains, scientific domains, there's interpretation and subjectivity, and they're good and reliable science. But, there is a but here, when there is subjectivity, there is a danger of being vulnerable to cognitive contamination. When I say cognitive contamination, it's a nice word to talk about bias. And the example here would be that if we give lawyers, jurors, judges criminal records and evidence, the same, but we attach different photographs, they're more likely to convict people who are less attractive. If you're more attractive, you're less likely to be found guilty. And if the evidence is overwhelming, they will find you guilty but send you to less years in jail. So attractive but guilty, attractive bias. And this has been replicated time and again. This is terrible, right? The fact that someone is more attractive doesn't mean that the person on the right is more a nice person, a moral, warm, intelligent human being. However, we have an attractive bias. Why do we have it? We have it because if you watch movies and the Oscars and the media and you watch films, the good guys and girls are good looking. They're attractive people, and this hasn't changed. Some things are much better. When I grew up and watched TV, all the bad people were Mexican and black. And this has gotten much better. And women were also, right, they were portrayed very negatively. Every time there was a problem, they would come to Captain Kirk to save them, and they'd stand there incompetent, helpless for the men to fight. In the new Star Trek, no, women kick ass and they fight and they're powerful, right? But in the olden days, when there was a fight, they would just stand there helpless. So when it comes to women, when it comes to minorities, we've moved a long way. When attractiveness, we still have a problem. Talking about African American and attractiveness, here is an attractive young African American. I would rank him as attractive, but on a scale of 1 to 5, I'd give him a 10. And not only is attractive, but he's very smart, and he's witty and funny and sensitive, a wonderful human being. And I can say that with confidence, because that's my son. Now, there is a point here, because as you can see, we don't look very similar. He is my biological son. He's my flesh and blood. But his biological mother is not white. And I raised him by myself as a single parent, and we're very close, and we traveled. And when we go, we hug each other, we walk hand in hand. What happens when people see us? They think we're a gay couple. And seriously, sometimes because he's younger than me and better looking than me, they think he's a male prostitute. Now, it gets more interesting because he's doing a PhD right now at Harvard in philosophy. And he goes and he tells people, you know, I'm doing a PhD in philosophy. And they say, no, really, tell us what you're really doing. They're laughing. They don't believe that an African American is doing a PhD in philosophy at Harvard. Why? Because in the United States, if African Americans go to graduate school, they don't go often to humanities. Less than 1% of the PhD students in the United States are African American. And he's in Harvard, and he started when he was 20 years old. So no way when a 20-year-old African American says that. Now, this is not racism, this is not discriminatory bias, it's cognitive bias, it's implicit bias. Now, I know what you're thinking, well, it doesn't happen to me. The people who do that are ignorant people, hillbillies, rednecks, whatever expression you want to use. No, also intelligent people, even the Harvard people who are politically correct and quite intelligent, they're no different from everyone else. Last year, I gave a talk at the Harvard Law School, meta-expertise about sources of bias in expert decision-making, the use and abuse of science and expert witness in the court, and it was sponsored by the DA and the public defender, and they were very nice. They made this big poster all over campus with my picture. Now, my family name, Dror, D-R-O-R, is not a very common family name. What happens when people who know my son see this poster at Harvard? They come to my son and say, oh, you won't believe the coincidence, someone with the same family name is giving a talk. It doesn't occur to them that we're family related, that he's my own flesh and blood, that he's my son. So we're not immune from that. Why does it happen? Very simple, because the brain is biased. There's cognitive bias in the brain, because the way the brain processes information and the mechanisms that underlie perception, judgment, and decision-making are biased. And I've worked with the US Air Force on pilot decision-making, and they have biases, and frontline police and SWAT teams who have to decide on perception of risk and decision to use force, and they're biased, and medical surgeons are biased, and forensic examiners are also human beings, and they're expert, and they have the same cognitive mechanisms, and this applies to every expert domain. Let's look at an example. Let's look at a forensic example. When you look at the skeleton, and if you have to decide if it's a male or female. So I don't know if you've heard, a few months ago, less than a year ago, they found, the Washington Post, Wonder Woman lives, Viking warrior skeleton identified as female 128 years after discovery. They found a Viking skeleton over a century ago and determined that it's a male. And now, after 128 years, suddenly, with DNA, they find it's a female. Well, maybe you don't read the Washington Post, the Guardian, maybe you read the New York Times, maybe the Independent, CNN, National Geographic. It's all over the news. What is going on here? So, Viking warriors, hey, they're warriors. They're also quite powerful, known, vicious. They take no prisoners. And what happens when you find a Viking warrior grave? And not only a Viking warrior, one of the most decorated top warrior. And it's a simple forensic decision. They're not going to decide based on the skeleton, did the person die from a trauma or not? And they don't have a fragment of a bone. They have a full skeleton and the gender, and they find weapons with it. And given their expectation that Viking warriors are tough guys and men, they make that issue. In the Journal of Forensic Science, it's very interesting that the commentary on a paper on identifying soldiers from World War II. And they say in the commentary, very interestingly, sex and age would have been estimated without the biased assumption that all remained was those of young adults, late adolescent Norwegian males, unless evidence indicated otherwise. This would have identified the presence of female and other outlying individual rather than force-fitting the remains into preconceived parameters. And that is exactly right. And we have research on that. We give a skeleton, a female skeleton, and see if people decide it's a male or female skeleton, and we give them context before they see the skeleton, they read something that causes them to think they're going to see a male or female skeleton. They get the context that it's a female, and they all decide that it's a female because it is a female skeleton. What happens when they think and expect a male skeleton and get a female? Only 38%. This research was done by Dr. Nakazadeh and has been published, and now there's a new research coming out in the Journal of Forensic Sciences on bias cascade from the crime scene to the laboratory. So this is just an example to start understand what I'm talking about when I talk about cognitive bias. I need to emphasize that people who understand bias, cognitive bias, will not, I'll say it again, not talking about intentional bias. We're not talking about unmotivated, incompetent examiners who need more training. We're talking about competent, able forensic examiners who are doing a great job. They are the ones we're talking about. And initially, when I started in forensic science, it was not acknowledged very much. Now, things are much better. And when I say not acknowledged very much, I mean, there was some very unpleasant defensive, aggressive responses of denial. Now things are much better. And I will quote a paper saying there's a growing consensus in the forensic science community that context effects must be acknowledged and that our work practices should minimize the risk they pose. Forensic XXX, field whatever field, is no exception to this need, especially because at least some small degree of judgment is required in forming most opinion. So if you're in a forensic domain that there is at least some judgment and interpretation, which is a compliment. It makes you smart and expert. You're not just machines. You know, you have judgment and discretion. You need to worry about this issue. This is a paper, again, in the Journal of Forensic Science by Archer and Wallman. Archer and Wallman, are you here by any chance? Archer, Wallman? They're not here. Okay. They talked about forensic entomology, but you can feel whatever you want there. And it's in The Economist. You can see ignorance is bliss. Forensic scientists know too much about the cases they investigate. In Nature, they're talking about it. In the UK, the forensic science regulator has guidance about it. In the United States, the National Commission on Forensic Science doesn't exist anymore, and that's too bad, ensuring that forensic analysis is based upon task-relevant information, a great document that I advise you to look at. Now, I said that in the beginning, they were not very happy with it. I have to admit, I have to acknowledge that some have been open and accepting from the very start. For example, the Academy. You have had many conferences and workshops, and you always were open to it. The Journal of Forensic Science has been the leader in publishing it, and it's a credit to the journal and a credit to the editor who were open from the beginning. And NIJ, the National Institute of Justice, from day one, they were open and listened and funded it. So it's not that everyone was against from the beginning. Things are better now, but there's still denial. Some people are still denying about cognitive bias. For example, I'll be positive and won't give any bad examples today. It's hard, but I'm going to shut up on that one. So the discussion now is not if it's cognitive, but what it is, why it happened, when it happened, and how to deal with it. I've already talked a bit about what bias is, and I have one more thing I want to say, trying to contribute to knowing when it happens, why it happens, and how to deal with it. But before I do that, I want to say, don't overreact. Some people have taken my research and distorted it or panicked and have overreacted. The problem is not so big. You don't have to kill a fly with a cannon. But to understand what you need to understand where it comes from and what it is. So don't overreact. And many people, or some people, have overreacted more than I'm saying and more than my data is saying. And you can read the paper. I am careful in what I say, but it's very hard for you to judge if you don't understand what cognitive bias is. So we need to understand it. Back in 2012, again, Journal of Forensic Science, I write, this is my paper, for forensic science to successfully take on the issue of contextual bias, it's important that one correctly considers the risk, that measures are taken when needed, and that they are proportionate and appropriate. Correctly considering the risk, take action when it's needed. Most time, it's not needed, and when you respond, proportionate and appropriate to the risk that is posed there. So that leads me to the last thing I want to talk about, which is sources of cognitive bias. I identify 7 sources of cognitive bias in forensic examination. You have the forensic examiner, and you have all these 7 factors working on their brain and influencing them. Again, cognitive bias. Some of those factors relate to the case evidence. It's a case in front of you. The evidence in the case in front of you can cause you bias. Some of them have nothing to do with the case at hand, but have to do with your experience, the culture, and a lot of training and motivational issues. And at the very bottom, it has nothing to do with your experience and your motivation, but with human nature, with cognitive architecture that's inherent to human nature. So let me start at the top. It usually takes me 16 hours to go through the 7. I'm going to do it in 25 minutes that are left. So at the very top, we have case evidence. So case evidence, actual evidence, sometimes contain inherently some contextual information that potentially can bias you. And sometimes you can't take it out. Well, life is not perfect. And sometimes you can't, and you've been exposed to it because there's no other way, and that is fine. However, in other times, you don't need the context. If you're a handwriting examiner and you're comparing signature, you don't need to know the context of the letter, what the letter says, right? You just need to compare the handwriting that is there, and you compare the signatures. And when I go to labs and see people who compare signatures, they have a lot of information. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a simple takeaway message. Remove, when possible, sometimes it's impossible, sometimes it's too much effort and too much money, but when possible, and the handwriting is a very simple example, remove irrelevant information. What is relevant or not is problematic, but you're going to do it because you're the experts, who I wouldn't know. People who are not forensic experts in your domain could not determine, but you need to determine that. That's a case evidence. Sometimes you can't remove it, sometimes you can. Then we have the reference material. When you compare the firearms or the fingerprint or the handwriting between the evidence in the crime scene and a suspect. And this is the case, a serial murder case in London, the Levi Balefield, and they found a one-frame picture of the car of the serial murderer, and this is the actual evidence in the case of the registration plate, the license plate. And I get involved in this case. I usually don't like to get involved in criminal cases. I work with the forensic examiners. And what I found, and that forensic experts were able to say quite a lot about the registration plate. Now, to me, it looks like very blurry and meaningless, but I'm not a forensic scientist. They were able to say a lot about it. But when I look at the record, I find out that the detective came to the examiner and told them before they looked at the evidence, I know who did it. It's Levi Balefield. Here is the license plate. Go see if you can find it in the evidence. So what they did is the way I and the ancient Romans do archery. We take a bow and arrow, we shoot the arrow, it flies, hits the tree, and then we draw the target. Always bullseye, we never miss. In cognitive terms, we call it backward reasoning, circular reasoning. You're supposed to have the evidence drive the process and not look for the suspect in the evidence. And for this, we have a simple procedure, a simple take-home message, linear sequential unmasking, LSU for short, the solution. It's a contextual management toolbox. Again, Journal of Forensic Science. It's published. You can read the detail. And linear sequential unmasking applies to, for example, fingerprints. When you have a latent print and you examine it, or next to a 10 print, the suspect. You see it's very different when you see it by itself solo versus if you see it in a pair. And again, we have data, it's all published papers, you can find them in different journals, on my website, it's all there. DNA. Yes, DNA also. You want to develop the profile of the evidence from the crime scene without being exposed to the suspect. And there's a new paper out in Science and Justice with the leaders in DNA, Bruce Badoli and others, strengthening forensic DNA decision-making through a better understanding of the influence of cognitive bias. Forensic anthropology, I've talked about that. Firearms, paper on firearms, on implementing context, information management in forensic casework, minimizing contextual bias in firearm examination. Video, every aspect of forensic evidence, it doesn't fit perfectly. It needs to be modified depending on your forensic domain, what information you get and when you get it. Even for CSI, blood pattern analysis, when you don't have a comparison, right? It's not a match. You come to a crime scene, or you're looking at a blood splatter, but it can be applied, and if I had time, I would give you some ideas how to do it, but this is a take-home message for you. Every aspect of human activity, it is relevant because of how the brain and the cognitive architecture works. Linear sequential unmasking, LSU, get the information you need. Don't panic. No one, or at least not me, is going to take information that is relevant that you need to do your task. Get the information you need, but get it when you need it. You don't need to get it all in the forefront. If there's a piece of evidence that you need at step 8 in your analysis, get it at step 8. Get the information when you need it, and document. Don't document at the end. Document as you do the forensic analysis. And the big question, can you go back? I'm getting more and more information. Suddenly I'm getting more information. Can I go back and change my mind what I did initially? Right? You're moving whatever domain, can you go back? That's a difficult question. If I say no to you, and I'm not saying no, that's too harsh. Sometimes you get a new piece of information, you want to go back and change what you decided before you got it. That's fine. I don't want to be too harsh. We need to be flexible in the procedure. However, if I say yes, it's too open. You go back and change and change and change. So linear sequential unmasking gives a balanced approach. It said, yes, you can go back, you can make changes, that's fine, but there are restrictions. For example, there's a few examples in the paper, and there's more. You can come up with your own restrictions, and you think about it, and you decide what you want to do, and you need to document how that happens, and there's transparency to your decision-making, which is very important. Linear sequential unmasking is aimed to make sure that evidence is driving the process. It's the evidence that is drawing the conclusion and not the suspect. It's to avoid what we call suspect target-driven bias. Don't want to walk backwards and avoid what your mother told you. If you don't succeed, try and try again, right? The detective knows, he confessed, he committed crime before. Just keep looking at the evidence and do digital enhancement and all the great stuff you're doing, and you work until you're able to match. No, that is not good. You need to have the evidence drive it, and again, you can read the paper in Forensic Science GSS, sorry. Irrelevant case information. Here we're not talking about the evidence, contextual information. You compare two faces. You have to decide how similar the faces are. I don't know how you do it, but you do it. But we don't want you to bias you. So we take these two faces and we give it to people, and we tell some of the people they're strangers, and we tell some of the people they're family related. It's a mother or a daughter or two brothers. The fact that you believe that they're family or not doesn't change your faces. It's the same nose and same eyes and same everything. But it changes the brain and how you perceive the similarities out your awareness. If you don't know Latin, like father, like son, perceived resemblance and the belief in genetic relatedness. So there are papers on that. Again, this is a kind of contextual information that is not relevant to your work. Well, there are many contexts. For example, whether the person confessed to the crime or not, irrelevant, I would think, to any forensic domain. I cannot think of a forensic domain because there are things that are relevant to some forensic domains and not relevant to others. But eyewitness identified him or not, what the detective thinks. What the detective thinks is very important for the prosecutor, for the fact finder, for court, not for a forensic scientist looking at scientific evidence. Who cares what the detective thinks? I don't want to know I don't want to even know who the detective is, because some detectives I think are great and some I think are less great. This is all not relevant to science matter, to do science properly, and the nature of the crime. Meta-analytically quantifying the reliability and biasability of forensic experts. Journal of Forensic Science again. Here is an example from the United States. The exact name of the jurisdiction in the detective, I have original documents, but I blackened it out, so we don't say, oh, this state or this kind, So here we see, what do we see? It's a homicide. When you're comparing, for example, firearms, cartridges, breech face, do you need to know if the bullet killed someone or hit someone? Is it relevant to you? The victim is white. The suspect, a black person. Do you need to know the race when you're comparing firearms? Do you want to know the religion, the sexual orientation, if they have a criminal record? I go to labs and the forensic examiners get the criminal record of the suspect. That's relevant to many people, to the prosecutor, the detective, but not to people doing science. If science matters, you need to focus on the scientific evidence. It gets better. On the bottom, I'm going to remarks. And before I show you the remarks, I'm going to zoom in. We're not talking what they talk in the corridor or when they go to the pub or do barbecue, which a lot of information passes in form. This is a written request from the detective to forensic examination, and the detective said, this is the person who pulled the trigger. make every effort to place him in the truck, and it depends on you to get the black guy who shot this white guy because the only witness in the truck was too drunk to make an ID. I'm really happy you're laughing because a few of the Detroit people say, oh, that's fine. And this person is sitting in jail because this evidence was presented in court and the identification was made. I'm not saying that the decision ID was incorrect. It may have been correct. Bias doesn't mean the conclusion is wrong. But it may have, and we don't want and don't need that. That's a simple takeaway message. Forensic examiners, you are so good at thinking and taking steps and spending money on physical contamination, transfer, and you put gloves and you put masks and you... What about cognitive contamination? Because you're the instrument of analysis, you need to start thinking about it, and there are simple measures that you can take. The goddess of justice, ladies and gentlemen, old wisdom, she's blindfolded. They're weighing the evidence. The evidence needs to speak. You don't want to see the race and if they have a criminal record and all the contextual information. The scale of justice. You're familiar with it, right? Look at the American Academy of Forensic Science. The scale of justice are on your logo, ladies and gentlemen. And you need to weigh the evidence and be blind to irrelevant information. This has been adopted by the US National Commission on Forensic Science, the UK forensic regulator, and I think you should adopt it not only because they did, but because there's good reasons to do that. Moving down the pyramid as time will permit, and again, as we understand the sources of bias, we can take measures. Base rate expectation, that's a hard one to explain. Let me try to do a demo. Count how many Fs you see here, please. How many people don't see any Fs? Okay, how many people pick up your hand high, see 3 Fs? 4 Fs? Hey, maybe I have the wrong slide, because I count 6. Let me see here what's happening here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You're scientists, you're blind, you can't count to 6. You do forensic evidence, there's 6. Okay, let me go slowly again, big font. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, for all of those who didn't see 6, good for you. You're expert in reading. You're biased base rate, but it shows intelligence. It shows you expert, because when you're a naive reader, then you start reading every letter, every word. The brain has limited resources. It's a fine-tuned machine. I'm not taking any questions right now. Later, come and talk to me. It's a fine-tuned machine. And you start reading, your kids start reading, you read every letter, every word. But the brain learns very quickly of, the, it's a waste of time to read. So it skips it, and you did it without awareness. And I bring students, I give them £1 for every F. It's $1.40. It's legal to drink alcohol at 18. It's a pizza and beer in happy hour. Extremely motivated students, almost none of them see. Now, they all see. Everyone saw the 6F. It's not a problem with your eyes. Don't go and change your glasses. It's base rate information that defines expertise, that you have experience in base rate and you bring it. And that's great stuff most of the time. That's why you're expert. This is a cognitive base rate information. You learn from it. It's why you're so good, why you're smart. But sometimes you need to know when it can lead to problems. If I had time, I would talk to you in the medical domain, in intensive care unit, in critical care units. There are big problems because of base rate, which I'm going to talk about in 2 weeks in Australia. In security X-ray screening, when you go to the airport and they say no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, no bomb, again, how the brain does. So we don't have time to talk about that. Does it apply to the forensic domain? You need to think about it. Do you have anything that you do again and again, and you try to do it, but the brain is going to learn? Maybe you verify IDs, and you always verify IDs. When you look and say, no, it's not an ID, it should be inconclusive. What metadata do you get? Use of technology. We have a whole range of papers, and you can think yourself, when you're really motivated, you're really trying, but you almost always get the same result, you can get into what we call base rate bias, and again, practical solutions to cognitive and human factor challenges in forensics. Practical solutions. We're not academic, some academics in the ivory tower coming and say, spend more money, have more. No, with the same resources, you can do better. And when I say better, I don't mean you're not already doing a great job. Are you doing a great job? I don't know. I'm not a forensic scientist. If you're doing great, I want it to be greater. And if you're doing a bad job, I want it to be a good job. And if you're doing very bad, I want it to be bad. That's want you to enhance your cognitive decision making. And I cannot judge a forensic work because I'm not a forensic examiner. Just like I help US Air Force pilots, I'm not able to fly a plane, a normal plane, let alone a supersonic F-15E model, but how to improve their cognitive. This is a science matter from the cognitive human factors issue. Organizational factors, well, there's a great paper by Dan Mary and others at UVA. Are forensic experts biased by the sides that retain them? And they find something called the allegiancy effect. They take the same data, the same evidence, and give it to different examiner, not changing whether someone confessed to the crime or not, only saying, I'm from the DA office, can you look at this information? Or I'm from the public defender. And you get an allegiancy effect. Again, you can read the paper, you get different results depending if the forensic person believes they're working for the prosecution or for the defense. And that's the allegiancy effect, and they're taking measures, just so you know to take with a grain of salt articles, on measures that have been published in peer-reviewed journal as objective and reliable. So it's techniques that have been published as totally objective, totally reliable, and you get this allegiancy effect. Again, you can read the details. My time, I don't have much more time. Training and motivation, a whole set of issues. Are you law enforcement or scientists? Don't answer that, but we do surveys, and many forensic examiners identify with law enforcement, putting the bad people in jail. I want to put the bad people in jail. I love law enforcement, but my job is certain, and your job is to be scientists. And it's something to think about. Are you scientists? Are you coming to the profession to be scientists? What's your motivation? What they trained? What do you get rewarded for? So I go and do training all over the US and other places, and I look at the corridor. In the corridor, I see the forensic examiner of the year. What did they do? They got the bad guy. They solved the case. And I say, you only reward them for making IDs and cracking a case. What about the forensic examiner who should get a reward, the most inconclusive reached in the lab last year? You're laughing, but they may have done an excellent job. It's not their fault that the evidence is inconclusive. When you start rewarding and giving all those nice things to the people who make IDs and solve crime, as scientists, it can be a scientist that works day and night and motivated and had inconclusive. It's not their fault that the data is inconclusive. So if you only reward when you crack a case and so on, again, you need to think that this unintentionally influences what is going on. How does it make you feel? Of course, it makes you feel good when you have an ID. We have papers on emotional experience and motivating factors. What about stress? All of us have stress in the universities, in the police, in the hospital, and forensic examiners have all the stresses that everybody has, which I'm not going to go, but you have additional stress beyond everyone. I've been working for 100 years, and I looked, there isn't a single paper talking about the stress and how it affects the quality of your decision, not a single journal peer review article. So 2018, Journal of Forensic Science again, from January, on human factors affecting forensic decision-making, workplace stress, and well-being. This is all things that come into the training, the motivation, and the environment. Cognitive architecture in the brain. In 2 minutes, I'll mention one issue, metacognition. People are not very good at assessing themselves, and when you're expert, you're even worse, yes? In the United States, when you get a driver license, you self-report your height and weight. Women take a few pounds off, and men add a few inches in their height. We call it a self-serving bias or optimism bias, and you can Google all these terms have been researched and you can see them. And experts are especially susceptible. My confidence is not very important. I write scientific papers and they just read the data. You appear in court and you write a report and your confidence is critical. When you go to court and you look the jurors in the eye and you speak in confidence, and they train you, it carries a lot of weight and you have to think how much confidence I should have given the data. Sometimes you should have the confidence, sometimes you should have less confidence, even if you got training how to look persuasive. You need to convey the correct strengths of the evidence, and in your reports, you need to say what it is. And there's always weaknesses, vulnerabilities, and limits in every data. There isn't data that doesn't have limited, a technique, a scientific technique. So I know you live in the adversarial system, which is a big problem. I talked about the allegiance effect, and it's very hard, but you're the scientist. It's very important that you think about these issues. So these are 7 different sources of bias. Again, very briefly, in the limited time we had, remember, cognitive bias, you need to understand it so you can correctly consider the risks, that you take measures when they're needed and they're appropriate and proportional. And you've seen that subjective judgments are fine, that's great, but they can also have susceptibility, how context can affect judgment without your intention, working backwards, and linear sequential unmasking. It's simple takeaway messages that you can start implementing today and tomorrow, and later next week change your procedures. My handsome, good-looking son. Unintentional base rate of experts, that the more expert you are, the more intelligent you are, the more things like this happen. And even the female warrior Viking after 120 years, 28 years, it's a female after all. It all has to do with the cognitive mechanisms of the brain, not intentional, but cognitive implicit bias. This is a new frontier of cognitive forensics, thinking about the human examiner, you, with the instrument of analysis. Thank you very much.